My wife looked me dead in the eye at a dinner party she had dragged me to and said in front of her coworkers that my salary was something a high school intern would be ashamed of. The table went silent. Then someone laughed, the kind of laugh people use when they want to look polite while enjoying someone else being stepped on. I felt the heat climb up my neck, and I remember thinking that if humiliation had a sound, it would be the scrape of her wine glass against the tablecloth. I drove home alone that night. Lauren stayed behind with her colleagues. Something about discussing year-end projections. I sat in my car for a long time outside our townhouse in Portland, watching the streetlights blink through the drizzle. There are moments when you feel a thin crack open beneath your feet, and you know deep down that your life is about to split in two. That was one of them. Inside the house, everything looked the same, but nothing felt familiar. Her heels were by the door. Her perfume still hung in the hallway. I walked into the kitchen and saw the dishes from breakfast still in the sink. My fault, she would say later. Everything was always my fault. I poured myself a glass of water and tried to swallow the tightness in my chest, but it stayed where it was, like a stone lodged behind my ribs. My phone buzzed. A message from her. Hope you made it home safe. Also, please remember to send your portion of the utility bill tomorrow. There was no mention of what she had said at dinner. No apology. No acknowledgement that she had turned me into entertainment for people who earned more in bonuses than I made in a year. I typed a reply and deleted it. Then typed another and deleted that too. Anything I wrote felt small compared to the weight of what had just happened, and there was something pathetic about begging your own wife to treat you with basic decency. So I put the phone face down on the table and let the silence press in on me. I barely slept. I kept replaying that moment at the restaurant. Her voice, the casual cruelty of it. I thought about the man I used to be, the guy who once got hired at a major financial firm straight out of college. The guy who believed he had a future. Somewhere along the years, things slipped sideways, and I ended up as a freelance data engineer, taking whatever contract work I could get. It was honest work, but inconsistent, and not the kind of career that impresses people in tailored suits. When I finally drifted off, the sun was already coming up. I must have been asleep for maybe 20 minutes when my phone started vibrating again. At first, I thought it was another message from Lauren. Maybe she wanted to laugh about something with her friends. Maybe she had found a new way to remind me of how far I had fallen, but it wasn't her. It was an email from Vertex Dynamics, the company where she worked as CFO. I stared at the subject line. Urgent request. Immediate action required. My first thought was that they must have sent it to the wrong address, but the message inside was short and too direct to mistake. Mr. Rowan, we need to speak with you regarding a matter of high importance. Please pick up when we call. There was no explanation. No context. I had never worked for Vertex. I had never even stepped inside the building. The only connection I had to that place was Lauren, and she made sure to remind me often that her world existed several floors above anything I would ever understand. The call came 5 minutes later. Unknown number. I let it ring twice before answering. A man's voice, clipped and urgent. Is this Michael Rowan? I said yes. He took a breath like he was steadying himself. We need your expertise. There has been an incident involving historical data your family may have been connected to. We need to meet today. My family. Those words woke something old and uneasy in me. My grandfather had worked in federal financial inspections during the 80s, but the details were fuzzy. He died when I was in high school, and my father never liked talking about him. The voice on the phone continued. We believe there are documents only you can interpret. Mr. Rowan, this affects Vertex at the highest level. I stood in the middle of my kitchen, still wearing yesterday's shirt. Still tasting bitterness on my tongue. A few hours earlier, my wife had mocked me for being insignificant. Now her company was calling me at sunrise, sounding like the floor was falling out beneath them. I asked the man on the phone, why me? Why now? Why anything? He paused long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said something that turned the back of my neck cold. Because your grandfather predicted this. The line went silent after that. No details, no instructions, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing filling the room. I picked up the glass of water from the counter, and my hand shook just enough to spill some on the floor. I stared at the drops spreading across the tile like they were trying to tell me something. Outside. A garbage truck rattled down the street, and the world looked the same as it had yesterday. But I had the heavy feeling that the ground underneath me had shifted. My phone buzzed again. A new notification. Not from Vertex this time. It was voicemail from Lauren. Her voice sounded different, tight, strained. Michael, please call me back. Something is happening at work and I need you to answer. Please, that word, please. She had never used it like that before. I checked the missed calls. 23, then 31, then 46. They kept coming. The number jumped again as I watched. My heart thudded slow and heavy in my chest. I walked to the window and looked out at the quiet street. Everything still, everything ordinary. But I felt the storm gathering somewhere just beyond reach. I didn't know it yet, but by noon, I would understand exactly why her company was calling me. And by sundown, I would be standing in the middle of something I never asked for. Holding the weight of a secret my family had buried for almost 40 years. The phone buzzed again. 48 missed calls now. I let it ring while the morning light crept across the kitchen floor. Something old had been set in motion, and it was coming straight for me whether I wanted it or not. My thumb hovered over the decline button while the phone vibrated in my hand. I let it ring until it stopped. The quiet after it ended felt thick, like the air in the house was holding its breath along with me. 50 missed calls, then 52. I set the phone face down again and tried to steady myself, but my mind kept circling back to that sentence from the man at Vertex. Your grandfather predicted this. It kept replaying in my head with a weight I could not explain. I went to the bedroom, pulled on a clean shirt, then stopped halfway through buttoning it because I noticed something on the floor near the closet. A cardboard box. Not one of mine. It had Lauren written on the side in her handwriting. She must have packed it last night or this morning before everything went sideways. Inside were financial reports from Vertex, printed spreadsheets, hard copies of board meeting summaries. I had never seen her bring work home like this. She always said sensitive material needed to stay in the building for compliance. Seeing this box here felt like finding a rattlesnake under the bed. I crouched and flipped through a few pages. Most of it looked like routine financial language until I saw a date printed in the margin. December 1987. My chest tightened. That was the year my grandfather retired from the Defense Audit Office. Coincidence, maybe. Or maybe not. The phone buzzed again in the kitchen. I ignored it and kept reading. On one page at the bottom right corner, there was a name. P. Monroe. My breath caught for a second. Patrick Monroe. My grandfather. He had audited early government contracted programs that later became part of Vertex. I remembered my father mentioning it once when I was a kid, but he shut down the conversation almost immediately. I slid the document back into the box and closed the lid. My pulse was beating too hard for something I did not understand yet. I walked back to the kitchen and finally answered the call on the next ring. It was the same man from before. His voice tense, rushed. Mr. Rowan, we are sending a car. We need you in Seattle as soon as possible. I asked him why. He ignored the question. Your grandfather's archived audit notes surfaced due to a data breach. They reference a pattern we believe you can decode. This is an urgent matter. We can discuss details in person. Then he hung up. For a few seconds, I just stood there holding the phone like it was something dangerous. There was no room to process what any of it meant, because another call started coming in. This time it was Lauren again. The voicemail icon flashed, and then more missed calls stacked on top of each other. Whatever pride I had left in me cracked just enough that I picked up. Her voice came through uneven and close to breaking. "Michael, please talk to me. Something is happening with some old audit files. We have federal investigators in the building." She took a breath, and her next words were almost whispered. "They think someone in my department destroyed records. They think I knew." I shut my eyes and leaned against the counter. She sounded scared in a way I had never heard from her. Then she said the words that made my stomach twist. "They asked specifically if you had any documents from the 80s. I looked at the box on the floor. I asked her why they would think that. She said a name I had not heard in years. Evan Torres. He was a data compliance officer who had left Vertex a few months earlier. He mentioned you in an internal memo before he quit. He said you might recognize some of the encryption patterns from your grandfather's work. I asked her how that made any sense. She said she did not know. She just needed me to answer the investigators before things got worse. Her breathing was shaky. "Michael, I am in trouble. Please call them." I ended the call without responding. Not out of cruelty, but because I did not know who or what to trust. My wife had made it clear last night where I stood in her world. Today that same world was collapsing, and suddenly I was the person everyone needed. That sort of shift does not come without consequences. The doorbell rang. I tensed so quickly the muscles in my shoulders cramped. I walked to the window and peeked outside. A black sedan sat in the driveway. A man in a gray jacket stood beside it, hands clasped in front of him like a driver waiting for instructions. I opened the door but kept the screen locked. He spoke through it calmly. "Are you Mr. Rowan?" When I nodded, he said, "I am assigned to take you to SeaTac. Vertex has arranged a flight to Seattle. You are expected." His expression did not change even a little. Not friendly, not threatening, just professional in a way that made it hard to read. I asked him who sent him. He only said the company needs your cooperation and time is critical. Something inside me bristled at that. My life had been squeezed into other people's expectations for too long. But I also knew something large was unfolding, and I was already in the middle of it. I opened the screen door and stepped outside. The morning felt colder than usual. He held the rear door open for me, but I walked around and sat in the passenger seat instead. If he minded. He did not show it. The car smelled vaguely of leather and something chemical. Maybe new upholstery. As we pulled away from the house, I looked back at the box through the front window. Sitting on the kitchen floor like a piece of the past, returning to claim something. The driver spoke only once during the ride. "You will meet Director Hanley when you arrive. He has been briefed." I asked him again what any of this had to do with my grandfather. He said your grandfather's investigation was never closed. That was all. Traffic was light heading toward the airport, and the silence in the car made my thoughts heavier. Every memory I had of my grandfather flickered through me. The weekend visits, the long walks where he barely spoke but always listened. The old gray ledger he kept locked in a desk drawer. The times my father said, "Let the past stay where it is." None of those pieces fit then. They were starting to fit now in ways that made my throat feel tight. At the departure lane, the driver handed me a packet with my boarding pass and a small envelope. He said your contact will meet you at the Seattle terminal. Before I could ask anything else, he returned to the car and drove off. Inside the terminal, I opened the envelope. It held a single note written in precise handwriting. Do not discuss this with Vertex personnel before speaking with the federal team. The signature was a scribbled initial. K. I stared at it until the boarding call sounded. The flight was short, but every minute of it felt stretched. My mind kept returning to Lauren's voice when she said she was scared. For years I had felt smaller than her, like a man living in the shadow of someone else's success. Now the roles had twisted into something neither of us understood. When the plane touched down in Seattle, the clouds hung low and heavy, like they were pressing on the city. A man in a dark suit was waiting at the gate holding a sign with my name. His eyes searched me as if he was measuring how much weight I could carry. As we walked toward the exit, he said only one thing. We do not have much time. Vertex is moving to contain the damage, and your grandfather's files are at the center of it. We need to know exactly what you have. I followed him through the corridor while my phone vibrated again in my pocket. I already knew whose name would be on the screen, and I did not look. Anything she needed to say could wait. Whatever waited for me in this city could not. The man in the dark suit moved fast through the terminal, and I stayed close behind him, trying to match his pace while my thoughts kept slipping back to the house in Portland and the box on the kitchen floor. We stepped outside into the gray Seattle air, and the cold hit my face like a warning. A black SUV waited at the curb with the engine running. He opened the rear door and gestured for me to get in, but I went around to the passenger seat again. If he noticed, he did not comment. The door shut behind me with a solid thud, and the sound seemed to mark a line between the life I had known and whatever this was becoming. Inside the car, he finally spoke. My name is Hanley. I run a federal oversight team that monitors high-risk financial contracts. He kept his eyes on the windshield as the SUV merged into traffic. Your grandfather submitted an internal audit in '87 that never reached final review. We believe Vertex buried it. A recent breach pulled fragments of it back to the surface, and those fragments linked to files your wife's department was managing. I asked why any of that involved me. He glanced at me, then returned his attention to the road. Because he used a cipher built from his personal notes. You are the only living relative with enough background to read it. Hearing that felt surreal. I had spent years scraping by on contract work, thinking my career had stalled out somewhere behind me. The idea that something I barely remembered learning from my grandfather might matter now felt both strange and heavy. I asked him what was in the files. He shook his head. We are not sure yet. Some sort of pattern indicating misrepresented assets. If it is what we think it is, Vertex could be facing federal charges. Traffic thickened as we moved deeper into the city. Towers of glass rose through the low clouds, and the gray water of Elliott Bay glimmered through gaps between buildings. Hanley leaned back slightly and lowered his voice. We have reason to believe someone at Vertex is trying to retrieve or destroy the last of your grandfather's documents. You need to be careful who you speak to. That landed in my gut like a stone. I thought of Lauren calling again and again, her voice tight and anxious. I wondered how much she knew, or how much she was hiding. I wondered if she had known about my grandfather's connection to the company and never told me. The more I tried to make sense of it, the less anything fit. The SUV pulled into an underground lot beneath a federal building near the waterfront. The concrete echoed with the sound of the engine as we drove down the ramp. We parked beside a row of black sedans with the government plates. Hanley stepped out and waited for me at the elevator. When the doors opened, he slid a key card into a slot and pressed the button for a floor that was not labeled. The doors closed and the elevator dropped with a faint hum. We stepped into a hallway lined with frosted glass panels. The air smelled faintly of old paper and cleaning chemicals. Hanley led me into a conference room with a long wooden table and a file box sitting in the center. His voice was measured. These are the fragments recovered from the breach. He pulled a folder from the box and spread several pages across the table. Dense columns of numbers filled each sheet. There were annotations in handwriting I recognized, but had not seen in decades. My grandfather had written the same way he spoke. Precise, steady, cautious. Seeing those marks again brought an unexpected tightness to my throat. Hanley pointed to a sequence near the top of one page. Do these numbers mean anything to you? They repeated in irregular intervals, almost like a rhythm. I ran my finger along the line as a memory surfaced. The summers I spent at my grandfather's house. The evenings he showed me how to read patterns in ledgers. The way he said that numbers had their own music if you listen closely enough. I stepped back from the table. It looks like a checksum pattern. Something that has been tampered with. Maybe hidden entries. Maybe inflated assets. Hanley nodded as if he had expected that answer. That is what we suspected. We believe Vertex has been overstating valuations tied to early contracts. If the pattern holds, it could unravel their financial reports for decades. The weight of what he was saying settled in. If this audit linked back to Vertex's current operations, then Lauren was standing in the middle of a collapse, and she knew I was the only one who could decode it. The realization pushed a mix of anger and something almost like pity through me. Even after what she had said last night, she had called me again and again this morning because she was drowning. Hanley gathered the papers and tucked them back into the folder. We need to retrieve the rest of the documents your grandfather left behind. You said you had a box from your wife's office. I told him it was back at the house. He studied me for a moment. Then we need to go get it. They might already be looking for it. Something in the way he said they made my skin prickle. I followed him back to the elevator and the SUV. The driver, a man I had not noticed before, sat motionless with his hands on the wheel. The ride back to the airport was quiet, except for the occasional hiss of tires on wet pavement. My phone buzzed again. I ignored it, but the vibration kept pulsing against my leg until I finally checked. 81 missed calls. Most were from Lauren, others from numbers I did not recognize. One voicemail from Evan Torres. My chest tightened when I saw his name. He had left Vertex months ago, and no one had heard from him since. I played the message. His voice was low, hurried. Mike, if you get this, do not talk to anyone at Vertex. The numbers your grandfather flagged in '87 match what I saw last year. They knew I found it. They know about you. The message cut off abruptly. I replayed it twice, trying to hear something else in the background. But there was only static. The driver looked at me briefly in the rearview mirror. You should tell Director Hanley about that message. I said I would, but my hands were already moving to call the number back. It went straight to a disconnected tone. As we neared the terminal, the sky darkened further. Storm clouds gathered over the sound, and the wind had picked up. Hanley opened his door as soon as we stopped. He spoke quickly with the driver, then turned to me. We need to move fast. Whoever is trying to erase these records will not stop. We will fly back to Portland and retrieve that box. I nodded, but my stomach was twisting. Something felt out of place, like a puzzle piece had been pushed where it did not belong. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling clung to me as we boarded another flight. The plane was half empty, and the engines roared loud enough that conversation was pointless. I kept watching the clouds outside, thinking of Evan, thinking of my grandfather, thinking of the night before, and the way Lauren had looked at me like she was reminding me of my place. Now that place had shifted in ways neither of us had prepared for. The descent into Portland was rough. Rain streaked across the window as the plane taxied to a stop. We stepped out into the cold wind and hurried to the parking garage. Hanley kept checking his phone as if expecting trouble. When we reached the rental car, he handed me a second key. If anything happens, keep this on you. It opens the secure room in Seattle. Do not lose it. We drove through the wet streets in silence until we turned onto my block. As we approached my house, my breath caught in my throat. A dark SUV sat idling at the curb. Its headlights were off. I could not see who was inside, but the shape of it was wrong, like a shadow that had weight. Hanley slowed the car. His voice tightened. Stay inside and do not move until I say otherwise. The SUV at the curb shifted slightly, as if someone inside had leaned forward to look at us through the rain. The air in the car felt charged like a wire pulled too tight. Then the SUV rolled forward a few feet and stopped again. Hanley reached for the radio clipped to his belt. Something is wrong. Stay down. The wind rattled against the windows, and for a moment all sound seemed to fade except for the steady thud of my heartbeat. The SUV at the curb crept forward another foot, then froze again, as if waiting for us to make the next move. The SUV inched forward with a kind of slow purpose that made the hairs on my arms rise. Rain slid across the windshield in thin, diagonal lines, and the streetlights behind the vehicle cast a dull glow across its windows. Just enough for me to see shadows shifting inside. Hanley held one hand near his radio and the other close to the door handle like he was ready to move the second something snapped. The SUV rolled another few feet, then came to a full stop directly across from my driveway. The engine hummed low, steady, patient. I felt my pulse in my throat. I could see my house behind it, lights off, blinds drawn, everything looking exactly the same as when I had left that morning. But now it felt like a crime scene, or a trap, or both. Hanley leaned closer to the windshield. They are watching the house. He whispered it, though I did not know why. The rain was loud and the car windows were up. Maybe it was instinct, maybe fear. He clicked his radio and spoke quietly to someone on the other end, then froze as the SUV door cracked open. A man stepped out. Dark jacket, dark jeans, short hair. His posture was relaxed in a way that did not match the situation. He looked up the street, then down, then directly at us. Even from a distance, I felt the weight of his stare. He walked toward the back of the SUV and opened the rear hatch. I could not see what he was doing until he shifted slightly. Then I saw the corner of a hard black case. Not a suitcase. A case. The kind that usually held equipment. The kind that never meant anything good. Hanley muttered something under his breath and reached across me, pushing my shoulder down until I sank lower into the seat. Stay out of sight. Do not look directly at him. I did not argue. The man stood with the case in his hands for a few seconds, like he was waiting for someone else to appear. No one did. He closed the hatch and turned back toward the house. He was heading for my front door. Hanley moved before I could process it. He threw the car into reverse and backed up fast enough that my shoulder slammed against the door. The man with the case turned sharply at the sound of tires splashing through water. He took a step toward us. Another. Hanley jerked the wheel and the car spun into a tight turn, sliding across the wet pavement before shooting down the block. I twisted in my seat and watched through the rear window as the man stopped in the middle of the street. He lifted a hand like he was trying to memorize the shape of the car, then lowered it slowly. The SUV behind him did not move. It just sat there like it had all the time in the world. We turned onto a busier road, and Hanley kept driving until the house was several blocks behind us. His jaw was tight, his voice low. They got here faster than I expected. Someone must have tipped them off that we were coming. He shot me a quick glance. Do you understand what that means? I swallowed. Someone inside your team. He shook his head. Or someone inside Vertex who still has access to federal channels? The rain thickened as we drove north. The kind of rain that blurred everything into gray shapes and streaks of light. I pressed my palms against my legs, trying to steady the tremor that had started without my permission. I thought of the box on my kitchen floor full of old documents. I thought of my grandfather's handwriting tucked inside. I thought of Lauren calling again and again, voice cracking with fear. Hanley checked his mirrors and finally eased the car into a quieter street. "We need to regroup." They were not there to talk. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel. They were preparing to breach your home. If we had walked up to the door, they would have intercepted us. Intercepted. The word stuck in my mind like a shard of glass. We parked near an empty strip mall on the edge of a residential area. The lights from a laundromat flickered weakly through the rain. Hanley turned in his seat to look at me directly for the first time since Seattle. "Someone is protecting that audit report. Someone powerful enough to send a team to your home before we could get there. If they get their hands on your grandfather's files, it will be impossible to uncover the truth." I rubbed my hands together, trying to think. What truth? What was my grandfather even investigating? Hanley opened the center console and pulled out a folder that looked older than everything else in the car. He placed it on my lap. "Your grandfather identified fraudulent asset reports from early government tech contracts. Those contracts were absorbed into Vertex when the company was formed in the early 90s. If he discovered systemic fraud, it could implicate multiple board members, including executives who still have influence today." My mind caught on one word: fraudulent. Another followed behind it: Lauren. Hanley kept talking. "If the patterns in his report match what we found in the breach, Vertex has been inflating valuations for 30 years. When the truth comes out, it will not be a financial scandal. It will be a federal case involving misappropriated assets tied to defense technology. And whoever tried to bury the truth then is trying to bury it again now." I stared at the rain sliding down the windshield, moving in thin lines like tears. My grandfather had been a quiet man, gentle but watchful. I had never imagined him caught in something this dangerous. I thought of the evenings he handed me old workbooks and showed me how to trace numbers, how to let patterns surface by stepping back and listening. The memories felt heavier now, as if they carried something I had missed for years. Hanley closed the folder. "We cannot go back to your house yet. They will return. We need the box, but we will have to retrieve it when the street is clear, or when we have backup." He tapped the steering wheel in a slow rhythm. "There is something else. Your voicemail from Evan Torres." He paused and looked at me again. "Do you have any idea what he meant when he said they knew about you?" I shook my head. Evan barely knew me. We had met once at a work function Lauren dragged me to. He had shaken my hand and asked questions about my freelance projects. Nothing more. The idea that he had connected me to any of this felt unreal. The rain softened slightly and the parking lot lights flickered again. Hanley lowered his voice. "Someone inside Vertex is making moves ahead of us. They knew we were coming to your place. They knew Evan contacted you. They might know you have documents. We need to stay ahead of them, and that means getting the rest of your grandfather's notes before they do." I felt a dull pressure behind my eyes, the kind that comes from too many shocks in too little time. I asked him where we were supposed to go. He checked his watch. "I want you somewhere secure until we can assess the situation. We will wait for an opening, then go for the box." Before he could start the engine again, a car turned into the lot. Not fast, not slow, just steady. Its headlights washed across the hood of our rental and then slid past as it parked near the laundromat. Hanley watched it carefully. A moment later, another car pulled in from the opposite side. The lot was filling too quickly for a rainy night in a quiet part of town. Hanley exhaled, sharp and quiet. "They are sweeping the area. He reached for his radio again, but stopped halfway, as if reconsidering. Stay low. Do not move. The car near the laundromat shut off its lights. A silhouette stepped out and stood under the awning, watching the lot. The second car had tinted windows so dark, the interior was just a shadow. My pulse kicked up hard in my chest. I felt the walls of the situation closing in, narrowing to a single point. Hanley finally spoke. We cannot stay here. Hold tight. He turned the key, and the engine came back to life. The man under the awning straightened at the sound. The second car rolled forward an inch, enough to show it had been waiting for this moment. Hanley shifted into gear. The rain started again. Harder this time, hammering the roof like something trying to break through. I braced my hands against the dashboard as we pulled out of the lot, the headlights slicing through sheets of water. In the mirror, I saw both cars turn toward the exit. They were following us. Rain blurred across the rear window in long streaks as both cars pulled out behind us. Hanley gripped the wheel tighter and accelerated onto the main road. My pulse thudded in a slow, heavy rhythm that made everything around me feel distant and too sharp at the same time. Streetlights smeared into white lines through the water on the glass. The two cars stayed back just enough to keep us in sight. Hanley kept his eyes on the mirror. They are not trying to intercept us yet. They are waiting for an opening. His voice had that steadiness people use when they are trying to keep someone else from panicking. But I could hear the tension underneath it. He took a sudden right turn onto a narrow residential street lined with small houses and dark windows. The wipers scraped across the windshield, barely keeping up with the storm. The first car followed almost immediately. The second hesitated at the turn, then slipped in behind the first, its headlights dimming slightly as if its driver wanted to stay invisible. Hanley cursed under his breath and turned again, faster than before. The rental car shook as the tires skidded against wet pavement. Water splashed up on both sides. I leaned forward and tried to steady my breathing. I kept replaying the image of the man at my house holding that black case. Something about the way he moved, calm and deliberate, told me he was not hired muscle. He was someone with training. Someone who did not care if he had to wait outside in the rain for hours to get what he needed. The thought made my hands tremble again. Hanley glanced sideways at me and spoke quietly. Stay alert. If they push us off the road, we will move fast on foot. Do not argue. Do not freeze. And keep your head down. I nodded, even though the idea of running through the rain with two cars behind us felt impossible. The street ended at a small intersection, and Hanley turned left, tires sliding before gripping again. We passed a shuttered hardware store, a closed cafe, and a row of dim houses. The rain softened suddenly, then came back harder in a burst that rattled the roof like gravel. The headlights behind us brightened. The lead car sped up, closing the distance. I saw its shape clearly now. A dark sedan, low profile, something built for speed. The second car stayed farther back but kept pace. Hanley accelerated. The engine strained but pushed on. He looked at his phone mounted near the dash. If we can get to the overpass, we can lose them in the traffic merging onto the highway. Hold on. He veered onto a wider road and pushed the car faster. The city lights blurred into streaks through the rain. The sedan behind us surged forward, and for a moment I thought it was going to ram us. Instead, it drifted into the right lane and held steady beside us. I could not see the driver, but I felt him looking at us. The second car closed the gap from behind. They were boxing us in. Hanley muttered something and braked sharply. The sedan in the right lane shot past us, then swerved back into our lane. The car behind us slammed on its brakes, tires squealing in the rain. The move bought us only a few seconds, but Hanley used them well. He turned into a side street so tight I was sure we would hit the curb. The rental lurched, but stayed intact. The two cars behind us overshot the turn. One tried to reverse, the other circled around to cut us off. Hanley pushed the gas and the car shot forward down a narrow residential block lined with old trees leaning under the storm. Their branches scraped along the roof as we passed. We reached the end of the block where a small park opened into a wide, empty field. Hanley slowed just enough to check the mirror. The cars had found us again. Their headlights cut through the rain like knives. He made a decision then. It was clear in the way his shoulders tensed. Hold on. He turned sharply into the park entrance, and the car bounced over the curb, rattling hard enough to knock the seatbelt against my chest. We sped across the wet grass. Mud sprayed up behind us. The field sloped downward and leveled out near a chain-link fence at the far end. The headlights behind us followed, two beams slicing across the park like hunting lights. Hanley hit the brake at the fence, yanked the wheel, and slid the car sideways along the edge. He stopped inches before hitting a metal post. He breathed out slow and steady and reached for something under his seat. It was a small metal flashlight, heavy and dented. "We get out here. Move fast and stay with me." He opened his door, and the wind shoved it wide. Rain slapped against my face as I stepped out. The field stretched behind us, glowing faintly under scattered streetlights. The two cars were closing in, engines loud and growing louder. Hanley pointed toward the maintenance shed near the corner of the fence. It was barely lit by a single flickering bulb. Move. Now. We ran through the mud, our shoes sinking with each step. My breath came in ragged pulls. The rain stung my skin like pinpricks. Behind us, the cars hit the grass. Engines roared as they climbed the slope toward us. I heard the sound of tires spinning in mud, then gaining traction again. Hanley reached the shed first and yanked the door open. The hinges groaned loudly. He pushed me inside and followed, shutting the door quietly. The shed smelled like old gasoline and damp wood. Tools hung from hooks along the walls. A mower sat in the corner. Hanley clicked off the flashlight and held a finger to his lips. Though the darkness was so dense, I could barely see him. The engines outside grew louder, closer. Headlights washed across the gaps in the wood slats, throwing stripes of pale light across the floor. I held my breath and pressed my back against the wall. My hands were shaking again. One of the engines idled right outside the shed. The headlights shone directly across the door, bright enough to push through the cracks. I saw the shadow of someone stepping out. Their footsteps came closer, slow and methodical. Water dripped from their clothes onto the ground. The door handle rattled. Once, twice. Soft. Testing. I felt my chest tighten. Hanley stayed still. The handle rattled again, this time harder. Then the footsteps drifted past, circling the shed. A second set of steps joined them. Someone tapped on the back wall with something metal, checking for hollow spaces. Then a voice, low, male. Not him. Not inside. Keep looking. The footsteps moved away. The headlights drifted across the shed one more time before the engine revved and pulled off. The second car remained for another long minute before it followed. The silence that followed felt unreal. My lungs ached for air, and when I finally took a breath, it came out shaky. Hanley waited several more seconds before speaking. "We cannot go back to the house. They know you have something, or they at least believe you do." He turned the flashlight back on, but kept it low. "We need to get to a safe location and make sure the documents are still there before we plan our next move." I nodded. My head felt heavy. My clothes were soaked through. The storm outside had started to ease, but the cold had settled into my bones. Hanley opened the shed door slowly and scanned the field. The cars were gone, but deep tire marks cut across the grass like scars. He motioned for me to follow. We slipped out into the faint drizzle and made our way along the fence until we reached a break behind a row of hedges. A narrow service road ran behind the park. It was empty and quiet. Hanley pulled out his phone. "I will call for a secure pickup. We need new transportation. The rental is compromised." He stepped a few paces away and began speaking quietly into the phone. I stayed by the hedge and stared out at the empty road. My hand still shook even though the danger had passed for the moment. In the pocket of my jacket, my phone buzzed again. I pulled it out slowly. 93 missed calls, all from the same number. Lauren. The screen glowed in the darkness beneath the hedge, and for a moment I could only stare at her name. 93 missed calls. I felt something twist deep in my stomach. Something that mixed exhaustion with anger and a strange kind of pity. Before I could think better of it, I answered the next call when it came. Her voice hit immediately, breathless and cracking at the edges. "Michael, please pick up." When she realized I was there, she drew a sharp breath that almost sounded like a sob. "I need your help. They are saying things at the office that are not true. They are saying I signed off on numbers I have never even seen." I closed my eyes and let the rain tap against my face. She kept talking. "They have investigators in the building. People are being pulled into conference rooms. They asked me again if you had anything from years ago." Why would they think that? Why would they think you have something that could hurt the company? Her voice wavered and tightened. "Please tell me you are not involved in something dangerous." Dangerous? I almost laughed. I almost told her about the cars chasing us through the storm and the man with the black case standing outside my house. But the words stayed lodged somewhere behind my teeth. She was not asking out of concern for me. She was asking because she was terrified of losing everything she had built. Hanley finished his call and walked back toward me. He lifted a hand signaling we needed to move. I spoke quietly into the phone. "I cannot talk right now." Her voice caught. "Are you with them? Are you with the investigators? Do they think I knew something? Michael, listen to me." I cut her off before she spiraled further. "Go home. Stay inside. Do not go back to the office until someone tells you it is safe." She tried to say something else, but Hanley motioned urgently, and I ended the call. The moment the screen went dark, the silence pressed in around me again. Hanley kept his voice low. "The pickup is 2 minutes out. We need to stay hidden until they get here." He scanned the road one last time, then nodded. "It is clear for now." A black sedan approached without headlights, rolling slow and quiet along the service road. It stopped beside us, and the back door opened just enough for us to slip in. The interior was dark, except for the faint glow of a dashboard screen. The driver was a woman in her late 40s, with sharp eyes and a steadiness that reminded me of someone who had spent years in federal courts. She gave a short nod. "I am Sarah Mitchell. Follow protocol and keep your head down until we leave this zone." The sedan moved smoothly, almost unnaturally quiet on the wet road. My breathing finally started to settle, but my mind kept churning. Sarah glanced at me in the mirror. "You picked up a call you should not have?" Hanley answered for me. "His wife. The situation is complicated." Sarah's tone stayed flat. "Everything is complicated when someone is lying." We drove for several minutes through neighborhoods washed in gray. The storm eased into a steady drizzle that clung to the windows and distorted the streetlights into soft halos. Hanley broke the silence. "We need to get the documents before Vertex's team comes back." Sarah nodded once. "I already requested a diversion. Local patrol units will be routed through the area for the next 15 minutes. That should keep unmarked vehicles from returning." The sedan turned into a narrow alley and stopped behind an abandoned tire shop a few blocks from my house. Sarah killed the engine and looked at both of us. We go on foot from here. Stay in the shadows and stay quiet. We slipped out of the car and moved along the alley, each footstep quiet on the wet pavement. The night felt thick, almost vibrating with leftover tension. As we reached the edge of my block, I saw my house through a break between two hedges. The street was empty. The curb where the SUV had been was bare except for tire tracks glistening with rainwater. Sarah crouched behind a large hedge and studied the house. 2 stories, west-facing windows, entryway partially covered. No movement, no lights. She looked at me. "You know where the box is?" I nodded. "Kitchen floor? Near the closet?" She motioned for us to move. We crossed the yard quickly and quietly. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might punch through my ribs. The front door was still locked. No signs of forced entry. Sarah tilted her head. "They waited for you. They did not want to break in unless they had to." We stepped inside. The air was cold and smelled faintly of damp cardboard. The kitchen was exactly as I had left it. The box was still there, sitting in the shadow near the closet. A thin trickle of water from my coat earlier had dried on the tile in a faint arc. I knelt beside the box and lifted the lid. Everything was untouched. I pulled out the oldest-looking document on top, a packet of audit pages with the year 1987 printed across the header. My grandfather's notes lined the margins, columns of numbers with slight inconsistencies circled in pencil, small notations that looked like nothing until you stepped back and saw the pattern. Hanley crouched beside me. "This is exactly what we were hoping existed." He tapped the margin lightly. These annotations matched the sequence we saw in the breach. Sarah stood near the window. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Take what we came for. Leave everything else. We need to move before someone decides to sweep this street again." I packed the documents into my jacket pocket. The weight of them felt wrong and right at the same time, like holding someone's last words decades too late. As I stood, a vibration buzzed through my pocket. I pulled out the phone and froze when I saw the number. It was not Lauren. It was Evan. Again. Or at least the number he had called from earlier. The fact that it was ringing now, while we were inside the house, made my blood run cold. Hanley gestured for me to answer, but put a finger to his lips. I took a slow breath and picked up. Nothing. Just static at first. Then a faint voice. Not Evan. A woman. Rough and strained. "Get out. Now. They are coming back." The line cut instantly. Sarah reacted first. "Move." She was already at the door. Hanley grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the hallway. We stepped outside into the drizzle, just as a set of headlights appeared at the far end of the street. 2 vehicles, unmarked, dark, traveling too slowly to be anything but intentional. Sarah guided us down the side of the house toward the yard. She whispered sharply, "Through the fence? Go." We slipped through a loose panel into the neighbor's yard and crouched behind their storage shed. The vehicles rolled past my house, stopped for a moment, then turned toward the alley behind it. Hanley exhaled hard. They were waiting for us to come back. They want those records badly enough to take risks. Sarah checked her watch. "We need to put distance between us and this area. I have a safe location near the Willamette River. Secure enough for tonight." We moved through backyards and narrow walkways until we reached a side street several blocks away. Sarah called for another pickup, and we waited beneath a canopy of dripping branches while I held the documents against my chest like something alive. My phone buzzed one more time. A new voicemail from Lauren. I did not play it. I did not have to. I already knew the shape of her panic, the sound of her voice cracking as everything she had relied on started to collapse. The street was silent, except for the rain and the faint hum of traffic far beyond the neighborhood. I looked down at the papers in my pocket. At the faint pencil marks my grandfather had left long before anyone at Vertex knew his name. They were more than numbers. They were a warning he had carried alone. A pair of headlights approached slowly from the far end of the street. Sarah tensed, then relaxed when she saw the shape of the grille. Federal Transport. She motioned for us to move. As we stepped toward the curb, I felt the weight of everything pressing in from all directions. The chase, the documents, the calls from Lauren, the strange voicemail warning us to run. It had all collapsed into one truth. Whatever my grandfather had uncovered was bigger than anything I had imagined. And whatever Vertex was trying to hide, they were willing to hunt us through the night, to keep buried. The Federal Transport slowed as it reached the curb, and Sarah opened the rear door without waiting for the driver to speak. Hanley motioned me inside and followed, shutting the door quickly. The engine hummed low as the car pulled away from the street and merged into a darker stretch of road that ran along the edge of the neighborhood. I kept my hand against the documents inside my jacket, as if they were the only solid thing left in a world that had tilted off balance. No one spoke for several minutes. The rain landed in soft taps against the roof, steady and unbroken. The driver's voice finally cut through the silence. We have reports of 2 unmarked sedans circling south of your location. They did not follow you here, but they are widening their perimeter. Sarah nodded. They will figure out we slipped through the backyard soon. We need to be gone before they realize it. I watched the houses drift past the window. Small squares of warm light glowing behind curtains. People inside were living their quiet, normal lives, unaware that a chase had unfolded only a few blocks away. I envied them and resented them all at once. Hanley leaned forward. Did you hear anything else in that last call? Anything that might tell us where it came from? I shook my head. The voice was rough, scared. It did not sound like Evan, Sarah added quietly. That number has been rerouted twice already tonight. Whoever used it is hiding their origin. The sedan turned toward a bridge that crossed the Willamette River. The water below looked dark and restless beneath the storm clouds. The city lights shimmered in broken reflections across the surface. I glanced at Hanley. What happens now? He sighed and lowered his voice. We study your grandfather's documents and try to understand what he uncovered. And we figure out who inside Vertex is trying so hard to shut this down. The road curved and the car descended into a quiet, industrial stretch near the river. The warehouse they brought us to looked abandoned from the outside. But Sarah's keycard opened the metal door, and motion lights flicked on inside. The space held nothing but a table, a few chairs, and a secure cabinet bolted to the wall. Inside, the air felt dry and cold. The rain sounded distant here, like it belonged to another city. Hanley gestured for me to sit. Spread out what you brought. I hesitated for a moment, feeling something strange coiled tight in my chest. Then I pulled the documents from my jacket and set them on the table. Pages yellowed with age, pencil marks faint but deliberate. My grandfather's voice buried in numbers. Sarah turned on a desk lamp and leaned over the pages. Her brow furrowed. Some of these entries do not match any government asset logs from that decade. Hanley tapped one column. Exactly. He found valuation inflation long before Vertex existed. These assets were rolled into early tech programs, then inherited by the company. After it merged with Monroe Analytics in '92, I felt my head lift slightly. Monroe Analytics. That name was familiar. My mother had mentioned it once, years ago, when my grandfather's old colleagues came up in conversation. Something small and quiet inside me shifted. Hanley ran his finger across a row of numbers. This sequence here appears in the breach. If we align your grandfather's notes with the modern ledger, we get a pattern that Vertex tried to hide for decades. Overstatement, double booking, transfer delays, all designed to inflate valuation. Sarah straightened. If this is true, they committed fraud, not just last year, but every year since the company was founded. That is a federal crime on a scale that could bury everyone involved. The weight of those words settled on my skin. I tried to imagine what it meant to be part of a company built on deception. To go to work every day thinking you were building something respectable when the foundation was rotten. I wondered if Lauren had known anything. I wondered if she had ever looked at these numbers and felt something was off. Hanley pushed another page toward me. Look at this. The number sequence your grandfather circled repeats again and again. It mirrors the valuation format used in Vertex's modern financial reports. Only someone with access to both systems could have carried that pattern forward. I stared at the page. It felt like a ghost reaching across 40 years. Sarah stepped closer. There is more. She placed a printed memo beside the documents. It was dated last year. The signature at the bottom made my stomach tighten. Lauren Rowan. My voice felt weak. What is that? Sarah answered. This is a performance audit she approved. It references the same valuation structure your grandfather flagged. She paused before adding, it is possible she signed it without realizing what she was validating. Possible, but not certain. I pressed my hands against the table and took a slow breath. Lauren had mocked my work, my salary, my worth, believing she stood on solid ground. Now that ground was cracking beneath her feet, and she was reaching for me because I was the only thing left. Hanley circled a line on the memo. If she signed this knowingly, she is complicit. If she did not understand what she was signing, she is a pawn. Either way, she is tied to this. I closed my eyes. The phone calls. The panic in her voice. She was drowning and she wanted me to pull her out without knowing she had helped build the flood. The warehouse lights flickered once, then steadied. The driver stepped inside from the hallway. We have movement along the riverfront. 2 vehicles, unmarked. Same profile as before. Hanley's posture stiffened. They tracked us faster than expected. Sarah grabbed the documents from the table and handed them to me. Put these inside your jacket. Do not drop them. The driver moved to the door and checked the alley. He lifted a hand. They are approaching from the east. Hanley lowered his voice. We cannot stay here. There is a secondary exit behind the building, but it leads to open ground. Sarah crossed to the secure cabinet and pulled out a small metal case. Inside were 2 flash drives and a thin black folder. She handed the folder to Hanley. Take this. We will need it later if we lose the originals. I felt the air grow heavier as footsteps clicked outside the metal door. Slow, deliberate. Rainwater pooled beneath the threshold. The driver whispered sharply. Back out. Quiet. Now. We moved through the hallway and out a side door onto a narrow walkway facing the river. The wind cut through my clothes and carried the cold of the water with it. I followed close behind Sarah as she led us toward a chain-link fence that bordered a service road. The footsteps behind us grew louder. Someone had opened the warehouse door. The driver reached the fence first and used a tool to snap the padlock. It broke cleanly and swung open with a low groan. Beyond it, the service road lay empty, except for a single maintenance truck parked near a cluster of trees. Sarah pointed. There. Move. We slipped through the fence and hurried toward the truck. The river roared softly behind us, and the storm clouds pushed low across the sky. I felt the documents pressing against my chest with each step. A sudden shout cut through the air. Voices. More than one. Then the hit of footsteps on wet concrete. They had seen us. Hanley grabbed my arm and pulled me forward. Do not look back. Run. The maintenance truck sat 20 yards away, its cab dark and its tires sunk slightly into the mud. Sarah reached it first and yanked the door open. She slid inside and reached across to unlock the passenger side. The footsteps behind us grew closer. Fast. Precise. The kind of speed that belongs to someone who knows exactly what they want. I reached the truck and climbed in. Hanley followed, slamming the door behind him. Sarah started the engine, and the truck lurched forward just as a figure appeared in the side mirror. A man in a dark jacket, short hair, calm posture, the same man from my house. He lifted his hand, not waving, signaling, as if telling someone we had been found. Sarah floored the gas, and the truck swallowed the road ahead. The river blurred beside us, and the storm rushed past in a howl of cold wind. I gripped the documents against my chest and stared at the dark road ahead, feeling the truth settle inside me. This was no longer about my grandfather, and it was no longer about Vertex. Someone larger was moving behind all of it, someone who had waited years for these documents to surface, and now they knew exactly where I was. Sarah pressed the accelerator harder, and the truck finally stopped fishtailing across the wet pavement. The river ran beside us like a long black wound, reflecting nothing but the storm and the faint glow of scattered lights. I kept looking back through the side mirror, waiting for the dark sedan to reappear. But the road behind us stayed empty. That somehow made everything feel worse. Whoever that man was, he did not rush. He moved like someone who believed patience would win in the end. Hanley leaned forward in his seat, breathing in controlled, steady pulls as he watched the mirror. He lowered his voice so only Sarah and I could hear. "We need to get to the federal office downtown. Once we get these documents scanned and sealed, we can put a protective order on them. After that, they become evidence and no one touches them without a chain of custody." I nodded, but my mind kept circling back to the moment that man lifted his hand behind us. It was the gesture more than anything else, silent and confident, like a signal sent to people I could not see. It told me this was not chaos. This was organized, planned, practiced. We reached the bridge into downtown Portland, and the rain finally eased into a thin mist. Sarah merged into the late-night traffic, and the hum of engines drowned out the tension in the cab for a few seconds. The city lights rose in front of us, tall buildings shining through the fog. And for a moment I felt almost disconnected from everything that had happened, like I was sliding through someone else's life, someone else's danger. Sarah spoke without looking away from the road. "Once we get you inside the office, you stay close to me or Hanley. Do not leave the secured floor for any reason until we tell you." I asked her how long we were supposed to stay there. She said as long as it takes to lock these files down and get you under official protection. Hanley added quietly. "And to figure out who inside Vertex is feeding information to the team chasing us." My stomach tightened. There was only one person at Vertex who had direct access to both the financial audit records and enough internal communication streams to know when we had left Seattle. The thought made my throat close. I did not want to believe it, not even for a second. But the possibility hung in the air between us. We entered the city grid and passed the familiar blocks near the courthouse. I grew up in this area. I had walked these streets with my father as a kid, never imagining that one day I would be driven here under armed escort, carrying documents someone had once tried to bury with my grandfather. Sarah pulled into an underground garage beneath a glass office tower. She parked beside a reinforced service elevator and killed the engine. The silence that followed felt strange in my ears, like the world had lost its sound for a moment. She stepped out first and scanned the garage. When she gave the signal, Hanley and I followed, keeping low and moving quickly. Inside the elevator, Sarah used a biometric key that unlocked a floor not listed on the panel. The doors closed, and the ride up felt like a long exhale I did not realize I needed. The secured floor looked nothing like the abandoned warehouse or the musty conference rooms I had been in earlier. It was bright and sterile, with reinforced windows overlooking the river and a long glass wall that separated the main workspace from the records lab. The air smelled of disinfectant and cold machinery. It felt safe in a way that made me nervous. Safe places had let me down before. Hanley guided me to a scanning desk. Lay them out exactly as he kept them. Do not reorder anything. He pointed to the documents in my jacket. Every mark, every number matters. I spread the pages across the table. The sight of them under bright lights made something inside me ache. My grandfather had written these in meticulous, careful strokes. He must have known what would happen if the wrong people saw them. He must have realized the weight he carried. And now the weight had passed to me. Sarah stood beside Hanley as he fed the pages through a digital scanner. The machine clicked quietly and coded each sheet into a secure archive. A federal case file number appeared on the screen. "This is good," Hanley said. "Once this number is tied to the investigation, no one at Vertex can claim ownership or try to destroy them." He handed me a copy on a drive. "Keep this on you." Before I could respond, Sarah's phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen, and her expression sharpened. She stepped away for a moment, then came back with her jaw tight. That was the front desk. Someone tried to enter the building using a temporary ID code. They did not get through, but they asked for you by name. My mouth went dry. "Who?" She shook her head. The guard could not see the face. They kept their hood up. Hanley turned toward me. "Did you tell anyone else you were coming here?" I said no. My voice came out rough. He studied me for a moment, eyes cold and calculating. "You need to think. Michael, did anyone else know where you were headed after we left the warehouse?" I shook my head again, but a terrible possibility surfaced before I could stop it. "Lauren," she had called again and again. Maybe she had contacted someone inside the company. Maybe she had reached out to the wrong person without understanding how dangerous they were. Or maybe she knew exactly who she was calling. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I hesitated before pulling it out. Another voicemail from her. I did not play it. Not yet. Hanley put a hand on my shoulder. "We need to finish this. Then we can figure out who is trying to reach you. You are safe for now." But the moment he said it, a sharp alarm rang through the secured floor. Not loud, but enough to make everyone in the room freeze. A red indicator light blinked above the glass wall. Security breach at ground level. Sarah was already moving. She grabbed her radio and barked out commands while she strode toward the main corridor. Hanley locked the scanning equipment and turned to me. "Get into the lab. Stay behind the reinforced door. Do not open it unless one of us comes back." I stepped inside the lab, and the heavy door locked behind me with a dull mechanical thud. Through the glass wall, I watched staff hurry into defensive positions. Armed security moved toward the elevator. The alarm continued its steady pulse. Someone had entered the building. Someone who was not supposed to be here. I stood alone, surrounded by shelves of records and cold white lights. My heart pounded in my ears. I could not see the ground-level cameras, but I could imagine the scene unfolding there. The man from the house, the unmarked vehicles, the voice warning me to run. It all pointed to the same force moving in the dark. Minutes passed, but each one felt stretched thin. The alarm stopped abruptly, and the lights returned to normal. Sarah appeared on the other side of the glass, her expression tight but controlled. She pressed a button that unlocked the door for her. "It is handled," she said. "False entry at the front desk. Someone tried to spoof credentials, but they never left the lobby. They are gone now." I let out a breath I had been holding too long. Sarah studied me carefully. "Do you need a minute?" I shook my head. "No, I need to finish this." Hanley returned a moment later with a printed summary of the scanned files. He set it in front of me. This confirms it. Your grandfather discovered a valuation schema used to mask transfers of federal assets into private contracts. It ties Vertex directly to misappropriation. I stared at the papers. So what happens now? Hanley folded his arms. Now we prepare to bring this forward, publicly and legally. You will testify. The documents will be verified. And the people behind this will finally face consequences. He paused and added, including whoever has been trying to get to you. My phone buzzed again. I finally opened the voicemail. Michael. Her voice cracked on my name. They think I knew something. They are asking questions I cannot answer. People are saying you have files that can ruin everything. I did not want to believe them, but I think you do. Please talk to me. I am scared. And I need you. I lowered the phone slowly. I had never heard her sound like that, not even once. Sarah looked at me. Do not respond yet. If she is in danger, we will address it. But right now, the priority is securing the files. The room grew quiet, except for the soft hum of machinery. I stared at the documents again, feeling the weight of 40 years of buried truth settling on my shoulders. It was almost peaceful. Almost. Then the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then the entire floor went dark. I stood frozen in this blackness. A chill spread through the room, like cold fingers brushing the back of my neck. Hanley's voice cut through the dark. Stay where you are. Emergency lights clicked on in dim red strips along the walls. Sarah checked her radio. No signal. The system is jammed. A surge of realization hit me hard. Whoever had been chasing us was not done. Hanley whispered into the dark. They found us. I closed my hand around the drive he had given me and took a slow breath. Everything that mattered was in my pocket now. Everything they wanted. Everything my grandfather had tried to protect. And the next move would decide how this story ended. I stepped toward the center of the lab, heart pounding, ready for whatever came next. If you want more stories where the truth fights its way to the surface and the past refuses to stay buried, follow the channel and let me know which truth you want to hear next.